Before serving as foreign policy advisor at the United States Southern Command from 2000 until 2001, Ambassador Maisto served as ambassador to Venezuela, ambassador to Nicaragua, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central American Affairs, and Deputy U.S. Representative to the Organization of American States. Ambassador Maisto served as Special Assistant to President Bush and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs for National Security Advisor Dr. Condoleezza Rice from 2001 until 2003. After which, he was nominated by President George W. Bush to be the U.S. Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. Additionally, Ambassador Maisto was named to be the U.S. Coordinator for the Special Summit of the Americas. The lecture topic that he's chosen today is the worrisome security situation in Central America. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Ambassador John Maisto. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The cultural side is very important, and I hope we're going to have the opportunity to explore a little bit. I'm going to try to speak as little as possible to give you the maximum opportunity to ask questions. Now, I hope that works out that way, but I will do my best. This is an international symposium on cultural diplomacy. I would first venture to say that it's very difficult in today's world to separate the various factors of world events and foreign affairs. Certainly there's a cultural side of diplomacy. There's a cultural side of relations that the United States and other countries carry on among themselves. But there's also a political side, an economic side, a security side, an environment side, an energy side, and we could go on and on. And I think what I'm trying to get to is a piece of advice an older diplomat gave me when I started my career, and he said, just remember one thing, everything is connected to everything else. And that's true. Everything is connected to everything else. And if you don't believe that, just look at all the factors at play in Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, the Middle East, to say nothing of our own continent. But today I want to concentrate on the immediate neighbors of the United States, Mexico, and particularly Central America. And I want to introduce a couple of other factors that have to do with the immediate neighbors. One is history, and the other is demography. And one of the questioners touched on the demography factor earlier, and I will deal with it briefly. But with regard to history, there's an old saying in Mexico and Central America that the Mexicans and the Central Americans, and I think some other cultures of the world, never forget history, never forget it. And Americans tend to never remember it. For us, things are now and the future. Don't bother me with the past. Wasn't my responsibility. Well, there is history and there is culture, and they have to be kept in mind as we deal with all of these issues. Then there's the demography factor. Here in the United States, it's the sheer numbers, just the numbers, and we hear about it all the time. We have between 11 and 14 million people in the United States who don't seem to have their papers in order the way the federal government would like to have that, and we have a political system that kind of refuses to deal with it. But we're going to have to deal with it. And because those things project our culture as well as the jazz groups and the movies and television, et cetera, et cetera. So we find ourselves in a post-Cold War period, in a period of heightened security concerns because of extremism in various forms. And we're attempting to deal with those realities and factor culture into it. And it gets a little complicated. But let me get to Central America. It gets particularly complicated there because Central America is so close to the United States, and it's poor, by and large. Has been poor for a long time. There is the end of the Cold War factor, and democracy came about. And it has been advancing in Central America. Imperfect, to be sure. Central America is full of elected democracies, weak democratic institutions, with the exception of Costa Rica, steady growth, huge poverty, small but growing middle classes, a good trade agreement with the United States, and countries that have avoided the U.S. financial crisis, interestingly enough. So did most of Latin America, by the way, because they did their homework and got their economic houses in order and didn't spend beyond their means. But the big issue in Central America, which affects us, is criminal violence. It is really quite staggering. Per 100,000 people, the homicide rates in Honduras are 82, in El Salvador 66, in Guatemala 41, and in the United States less than 5. That gives you an idea of how prevalent criminal violence is in that region and in Mexico as well. Not all parts of Mexico, but in significant parts of Mexico. Why is this the case? I would venture to say that criminal violence among our immediate neighbors takes place mainly because of the illicit drug trade. And that drug trade is mainly cocaine. 90% of the cocaine consumed in the United States comes out of South America. It flows through the isthmus, through Mexico, into the country. And let's face it, we have a drug culture in the United States. Consumption is something that doesn't seem to be much of an issue. It's kind of accepted. With the flow of narcotics north comes the money generated, which goes south into the gangs, the drug gangs, the mafias, and they in turn use that funding to buy political cover. And it can get pretty frightening. There are 70,000 gang members in the 3 northern tier countries of Central America: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Here's a cultural export item. The gangs, many of them which come from Southern California, these Salvadorians mainly, but also Guatemalans who speak perfect English. One of the projects is to get the gang members who speak perfect English to train them up and put them into call centers in El Salvador to deal with Americans because they speak the language perfectly. That's a small positive side. The result of the trade is a lack of institutional and financial capability to deal with the problems. There's corruption, violence, turf wars, the cartels that co-opt local government and businesses. They even provide basic services, including security. It's like the old-style mafia. Remember the Godfather movies? It's that sort of security that's bought. What does the United States and cultural diplomacy have to do with it? It's this. Our culture is also represented by our drug consumption, and that's a social side of it. And it's also represented by our political culture, which has to do with the flow of guns south. 87% of the arms that the Mexicans are able to trace have a U.S. origin. And we have a tradition of Second Amendment tradition, but we don't seem to be able to come to grips with controlling the flow of arms south. And the combination of drugs north and arms and money south is just very combustible for our immediate neighbors. Okay, so what does the United States do about it? And this is the policy side. And I bring with me a show and tell item, which I recommend to you, by the way, because it's very well done. It's done by the Council on Foreign Relations. It's online. It came out in April. The subject is countering criminal violence in Central America, because it's the number one issue. Poverty isn't the number one issue. Criminal violence is the number one issue, which contributes to poverty in some ways, and in some ways not. This very good review comes up with several observations that I want to share with you very briefly and then open it up to conversation. There's one chapter called U.S. Domestic Politics and Impact on Central America. And what it has to do with is, number one, how much money we spend on fighting drug trafficking and fixing it in the United States. 40% of our budget goes to treating. Let me see here. The right of. Let me see. Prevention and treatment has steadily increased, and only 40% of all the money we spend on drug control goes to treatment and health considerations. 60% goes to control. The figures of drug offenders in our U.S. Prison system is rather staggering. I talked about the arms flow south. But what are the recommendations for U.S. foreign policy? I recommend them to you. Let me, in typical Washington think tank fashion, and they're pretty well laid out. One, the United States should encourage the development of national strategies and support regional and international cooperation. Been doing that for years. Nothing new there. Two, the United States should focus on strengthening institutions, particularly police forces and judicial systems. Been doing that for a long time. The United States should support the creation of bodies similar to a UN body in Guatemala that supersedes the Guatemalan justice system to deal with corruption and narcotics trafficking. It just displaces the judicial system. It's a sacrifice of sovereignty, but the Guatemalans have gotten so desperate that they accepted it. And I think it's a very good idea myself. Another, the United States should facilitate scaling up successful local crime prevention initiatives by sharing knowledge and experiences. Yes, doing it, but there's always the problem of the bad guys getting the information. 5, the United States should minimize the role of foreign military assistance. I don't agree with that. I think that the military in Central America and in South America has become a more controlled institution by civilians. We may get some pushback by people who come out of Africa, who deal with a superpowered military in their institutions. But by and large, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the military, I would submit, has made a positive contribution to the development of democracy. 6, the United States should strongly encourage national governments and private sector leaders on tax reform and to shore up anti-crime efforts. Yes, of course. And then the United States should temper domestic politics that aggravate criminal violence in Central America, such as not resolving our immigration issue, such as not dealing with our narcotics consumption. So those are my comments. There is a cultural side to the bad security situation in Central America. We have not done what we should be doing internally in our own culture. We do things. We have a policy. It's a bipartisan policy. Hasn't changed roughly since the end of the Cold War. We should probably spend more money on it. We spend much more money in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. If we spent a tenth of the money in Central America, our immediate neighbors, we would be doing ourselves a big favor. But we have to face up to these things ourselves. So I will stop there. I will embrace such things as Fulbright programs, which I myself participated in many years ago, such things as a desire of the president to have more university students go in both ways to Latin America and the Caribbean. It's wonderful, but you got to put money to it. And suggest to you that there is a dark side of our cultural experience, and we have to pay some attention to it at the same time that we extol and we embrace the bright, positive side.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Maisto, for, I think, a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure you've inspired questions and comments. Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to pose a question or ask a question. Yes, okay. And if you could come a little bit out of the camera.
Hi, my name is Alessandra. I come from Miami, Florida International University. As I'm sure you know, Miami is heavily Latin. Most of the people that are my neighbors are from Venezuela and Colombia. I know you were speaking about Central America, but what would you say to people who are fleeing places like Venezuela and Colombia, who are often kidnapped whenever they try to return? What would you say is a good diplomacy approach when it's not necessarily drugs, as it is in Central America, and more political violence?
It's crime and political violence. In those countries, particularly Colombia, which has made great strides. You know, a dozen years ago, Colombia was considered to be almost a failed state. And the United States involved itself in very smart bilateral diplomacy and assistance. We provided between $6 and $7 billion over the last 11 years, worked with strong Colombian leadership, smart Colombian leadership, that began by taxing the private sector big time because they're rich there. And they put their own money to it. They got our money. We did 2/3 of our assistance was security and military. 1/3 was economic development. The Europeans contributed to all economic development because the Europeans don't like to contribute to military and security stuff. And by and large, it's worked. The FARC is still there. The kidnappings still take place, but it is much, much better than it ever has been. Go to Bogota, go to Medellin, go to Cali, go to Barranquilla, all of those places. Venezuela is another issue. Venezuela is, Venezuela is very dear to me. It has not had the best political leadership either before the Chavez Revolution or after the Chavez Revolution. They are attempting to work their way through it right now. It's a tremendously rich country. Institutions have been politicized and gutted. There is going to be a huge amount of work that has to be done. However, the best way to get this done for Venezuelans living in the greater Miami area is, I think, to participate more in what's going on in Venezuela. I have little patience for people who leave certain countries and then complain and then expect the United States to resolve their problems for them. The Venezuelans themselves are involved in a political process that's going to take place, it's going to culminate in October of this year in an election, and Venezuelans in the Miami area should be supporting that sort of self-determination, it seems to me, because democracy is very, very tough. It exists, elected democracy exists in the hemisphere, but democracy is just very, very difficult. It's day-to-day, it's justice systems, it's institutions, it's tax collection, it's professionalism, it's leadership, real leadership. Colombia has had it, Venezuela hasn't.
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Anna Kumbongengwi. I'm from European Peace University in Austria. Talking about global risks, drug is or has been one of the problems that has generated to so many other political issues that are causing national security in most countries. And some of the points you just mentioned carried out by the United States and UN has been going on for so long, but it seems to yield like very little result. So what other strategies are they trying to put in place to see that this is resolved?
Policies have been going on for a long time in many parts of the world, certainly in Mexico and Central America. By the way, just an aside, the second largest consuming country of cocaine after the United States is Brazil, by the way. It's a problem wherever drug use, wherever money is to be made, the people will engage in money making, producing and selling drugs. And the profits will flow, and the profits will be used to corrupt the system. What do you do about that? The fact that countries have been dealing with this over the years and not resolving the issues doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. I would suggest they should be doing more of what they're doing. They should be doing it smarter. They should be putting a lot of emphasis on education, a lot of emphasis on health, because one of the things that the bad guys do is they create markets among young people in country after country because it suits them. These young people then can become employable. In Mexico and in Central America, they're called the ni-nis. They're neither students anymore, nor do they work. And if you have young people who neither study nor work, and they have the opportunity to make money at all levels, this is down to the, to the barrio level, the favela level, the poorest, if they have an opportunity to make money, they're vulnerable. So it is leadership. It's getting money from abroad and using it well, using it smart. It's training. It's a judicial system that works. It's paying police a decent wage so that they do not become part of the problem, but part of the solution. It's easy for me to stand up here in Washington, D.C. and say this, but it is much more difficult in any African country or in any Central American country or even Northern South America. And by the way, there's an increasing problem in the Caribbean as well. So there is no silver bullet. There is no magic answer. The best possible government. Some people would say, democracy can't handle this. You need a dictator. Theoretically, a dictator could, but you sacrifice so many other things when you have dictatorship that it's not worth it. And usually the institutions become corrupted. People have the opportunity to make money, and it doesn't work. No easy answers, no silver bullets. Do it better, do it smarter, and do it with more funding.
Is there a final question here?
Thank you very much, sir, for your wonderful presentation. Chris Ibe is my name. I'm from Nigeria. I really want to ask, the activities of drugs in the Southern America has caused a whole lot of vibrations in sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely.
So if as it has been determined that the sub-Saharan Africa countries is being used as route,
Correct.
to moving these drugs, and both politically and the society has been affected. Outside the US and the Southern America strategy, so what do you think, what is the next line of strategy you people are adopting to make sure that these vibrations here, these actions here in the Southern America does not continue to affect the sub-Saharan Africa? Thank you very much, sir.
Certainly. You need a multi-tiered strategy. Let's start with the producing countries. The number one country that produces cocaine in the world today is Peru. The number two is Colombia. Number three is Bolivia. And as you get farther north, the production is aimed at the United States, and a little farther south, it goes out through Brazil and out through Africa often for consumption because they're building markets and to Europe. Okay, what do? You need a concerted effort. There is an international aspect to it. It has to do with institution strengthening. There is an aspect of political cooperation, in the case of Africa, particularly involving the European countries, to a certain extent, the United States. There is cooperation in law enforcement because, we're living in a globalized world, and the bad guys have globalized activities. They use GPSs, they use cell phones, they use Twitters and tweets and all sorts of things to move the product through. It has to be an unrelenting effort for cooperation, to fight corruption, to put the emphasis on health and education of young people, to provide opportunities to young people. I'm describing huge challenges to every country, including my own, the United States, to deal with this issue. There should be more emphasis on treatment of drug users across the board. It's a health issue. You're going to see the debate continue about legalizing. I don't think that gets us anywhere because there are too many countries in the world, too many societies in the world where that's just not acceptable. But it requires an awful lot of both horizontal cooperation among institutions in your own society, including organized religion, including civic organizations, including such entities as the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. All of that has to be part of the effort. And then big-time international cooperation on the law enforcement and the development side, and bilateral cooperation as well. It's a big challenge, and because it is so big, sometimes we don't really want to face up to it.
Well, Ambassador Maisto, you have certainly outlined some of the challenges facing us for the upcoming 10 to 20 years, but I think also some of the opportunities and the role that perhaps cultural diplomacy might be able to contribute also in this direction. So thank you very, very much for your keynote address, as well as the discussion that followed. And I'd ask us all please to give a second round of applause to express our gratitude to Ambassador Maisto. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.